Lucille Ball stopped for a broken-down Chevrolet on Highway 10 between Los Angeles and Palm Springs and discovered that the man standing beside it had built the electrical systems on the first sound stages she ever worked on and hadn't asked anyone for help in 30 years. What Lucille said when the man tried to refuse the ride is something his wife has repeated to every person she has told the story to since. It was a Saturday afternoon in March 1962, and Lucille Ball was driving east on Highway 10 toward Palm Springs, 2 hours from her home in Beverly Hills, heading to a weekend she had scheduled with the specific intention of being unavailable. The afternoon was warm and clear in the particular way of Southern California March, the kind of afternoon that is genuinely pleasant to drive through, and the kind that makes the desert worth the summer heat that comes later. She was in no hurry. She had nowhere to be until evening. She saw the car at 2:20. She was listening to the radio, a music station she had turned low but not off, and she was thinking about the weekend and what it required, and the car on the shoulder registered in her peripheral vision in the ordinary way that objects on highway shoulders register, present, noted, receding in the rearview mirror. She drove another quarter mile. She braked and pulled a careful U-turn where the median allowed it and drove back. It was a powder blue Chevrolet Bel Air, maybe 10 years old, pulled onto the gravel shoulder with its hood raised. The car was well maintained in the way that working cars are well maintained by people who depend on them, and clean interior visible through the windows, no visible rust, the kind of vehicle that is not new but has been cared for. The couple standing beside it had the posture of people who had been standing there for some time. The man was in his late 60s, wearing work clothes, standing with his hands in his pockets in the particular stillness of someone who is accustomed to solving mechanical problems and is currently trying to solve one without the tools he needs. The woman beside him had her hand on his arm in the specific way that people touch each other when they are offering comfort without words. Highway 10. Between Los Angeles and Palm Springs carries a mix of weekend traffic and commercial vehicles on Saturday afternoons. Lucille had been driving it for more than a decade and knew its rhythms. She knew the stretch where the road widened near Beaumont, the spot where the desert heat first became noticeable, the place where the mountains came into view if the smog was light enough. Lucille had passed perhaps 20 cars pulled over this way already that afternoon. She had not stopped for any of them. She would not have been able to say, if asked, why she stopped for this one. There was something in the quality of the couple's posture, perhaps, or in the specific way they were standing that was neither helpless nor distressed, but simply present with a problem. Whatever it was, Lucille was on the shoulder before she had fully decided to be there. The man looked at her. He was weathered in the way that men who work outdoors are weathered, the face of someone who has spent decades in bright light. And his expression when Lucille pulled over was not relief. It was the carefully measured expression of someone assessing whether this new development represents help or complication. "You folks all right?" Lucille asked. "Radiator," the man said. "Overheated about 20 minutes ago. Already called AAA. They said an hour, maybe more." He paused. "We're fine. Thank you for stopping." The last sentence carried more weight than the words themselves. Lucille put her car in park. "How long have you been waiting?" The woman spoke for the first time. "About 40 minutes now," she said. "How far are you going?" Lucille asked. The man's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Palm Springs," he said. "About 40 miles. We'll be fine." "I'm going to Palm Springs," Lucille said. "I have room." The man looked at his wife. "That's kind of you," the man said, "but we can wait for the tow." "I know you can wait," Lucille said. "I'm offering a ride. There's a difference." Something in that distinction seemed to register differently. The woman's hand tightened on her husband's arm. The man looked at Lucille with the direct assessing look of someone who has learned to evaluate situations quickly. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "Because you've been standing on a highway shoulder for 40 minutes, Lucille said, "and you're going to be standing there for at least another hour, and I'm going exactly where you're going." The man was quiet. "Name's George Hendricks," he said. "This is my wife, Dorothy." "Lucille Ball," Lucille said. George Hendricks looked at her. "I know who you are," George said. He said it in the flat, an unhurried way of a man delivering factual information, no change in register. Dorothy made me watch your show every Monday for 10 years. He paused. It's a good show. Thank you, Lucille said. Get in. George sat in the front passenger seat. Dorothy sat in the back. They brought one small overnight bag and left the rest in the trunk. Lucille eased back onto Highway 10. The afternoon traffic was moderate. She drove with complete attention to what the driving required. They drove for 15 minutes in silence that was not uncomfortable. George sat with his hands folded, looking at the landscape. Dorothy sat in the back, occasionally glancing at the back of Lucille's head with an expression that suggested she was still processing who had stopped to help them. Lucille broke the silence. And how long have you lived in Palm Springs? 32 years, George said. Moved there in 1930. What brought you there? George turned slightly. Work, he said. I was an electrician. Worked on the early sound stages when the studios were first putting them in. Lucille glanced at him, then back at the road. Which studios? RKO mostly, George said. Some work at Paramount. We did the electrical systems for Stage 12 at RKO in 1933. That was one of the first fully wired sound stages in Los Angeles. Lucille was quiet for a moment. The quality of the silence changed. Stage 12, Lucille said. That's right, George said. Why? That's where I did my first screen test, Lucille said. 1933. I was 22 years old. I didn't get the part. George turned to look at her fully. You worked at RKO? I worked everywhere, Lucille said. Mostly RKO in the early years. Stage 12, Stage 9, the backlot. If it had a camera and a light, I was there trying to get someone to notice me. She paused. If you hadn't wired that stage, I wouldn't have had that screen test. George Hendricks sat very still. Dorothy leaned forward from the back seat, her expression focused entirely on what her husband was hearing. I wired a lot of stages, George said quietly. I know, Lucille said, and I failed a lot of screen tests, but someone had to build those stages before people like me could fail in them. They drove in silence for another few miles. George sat with his hands still folded, but the quality of his posture had changed. I left the studios in 1940, George said. The work was changing. Everything was getting more complicated. I wasn't keeping up the way I used to. He looked out the window. I opened a radio repair shop in Palm Springs, did that for 25 years, retired in 65. Do you miss it? Lucille asked. George considered the question. I miss what it was, he said. The early days when we were figuring out how to make it all work. We didn't have manuals. We were building something that hadn't existed before. He turned to look at Lucille. But I don't miss what it became. Too big. People stopped knowing each other's names. Lucille nodded. I know what you mean, she said. They talked more as the miles passed, not continuously, but in the intermittent, unhurried way of three people in a car who have found each other's company unexpectedly agreeable. George talked about the early sound stages and about the challenges of wiring buildings that needed to be silent while carrying enough electrical load for high-powered lights. Dorothy talked about moving to Palm Springs in 1930, about raising 2 children in a town small enough that everyone knew everyone, about watching the desert town become something else as Hollywood discovered it in the 1940s and 50s. Lucille talked about the early years at RKO, about being one of 70 girls in a casting call, about learning to hit her marks by watching the grips, about the terror of doing your first scene, knowing that 50 other girls are waiting to replace you if you make a mistake. At some point, George asked about I Love Lucy, about how the show had come to be filmed in front of a live audience when everyone said it couldn't be done. And then Lucille answered in the same straightforward way George had answered questions about electrical systems, without false modesty, explaining the technical decisions in the tone of someone describing work they had done. Someone had to figure it out, Lucille said. It was me and Desi and Carl Freund and a crew willing to try something new. Same as you wiring Stage 12. Someone had to do it first. George was quiet. I never thought of it that way, he said. They arrived in Palm Springs at 4:30. Lucille drove to the address George gave her, a small house on a residential street lined with palm trees, the kind of house built in the 1940s when Palm Springs was still affordable for people who worked with their hands. She pulled into the driveway. Thank you, George said. He said it simply, without elaboration. You're welcome, Lucille said. Dorothy leaned forward. "Would you come in for a moment? I have lemonade made." Lucille looked at her watch. "I'd like that," she said. She stayed for 40 minutes. She drank Dorothy's lemonade, which was tart and cold, and she sat at their kitchen table and talked with two people she had met an hour ago on Highway 10. The kitchen had the quality of a room that has been lived in for decades, the specific comfort of a space that has absorbed years of ordinary life. Lucille felt it when she sat down. At 5:20, she stood. George walked her to the door. "You didn't have to stop," he said. "I know," Lucille said. "Why did you?" Lucille considered the question. "Because you looked like someone who spent his life building things other people used," she said. And I've spent my life using things other people built." She shook his hand. She shook Dorothy's hand. She drove to her hotel and sat on the bed for a while thinking about the afternoon. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at the Hendricks house. Inside was a handwritten note from Lucille Ball and 2 tickets to a taping of The Lucy Show at Desilu Studios, with a note that said she had arranged for a studio tour before the taping. At the bottom of the letter, a single line: "Stage 12 still works. Come see what you built." George and Dorothy used the tickets in April. They arrived at Desilu Studios at 1 o'clock. A production assistant gave them a 2-hour tour, including Stage 12, which had been renovated twice since 1933, but still had the original electrical infrastructure George had installed. Before the taping that evening, all Lucille Ball came into the audience and shook their hands. The audience of 300 people did not know why she was greeting these 2 people specifically. Lucille did not explain. She shook George's hand and went back to prepare for the taping. George Hendricks told the story to his son the following week. His son asked what she was like. George thought about it. "She stopped," George said. "That's what she was like. She stopped when she didn't have to." His son wrote that down. Dorothy Hendricks, when asked about the afternoon on Highway 10, gives the same answer every time. "A woman stopped for us," she says. "George tried to say we were fine. She explained why that wasn't the right answer. We got in the car." She pauses. That's the whole story. The rest is just what happened after. She is not wrong. When 3 months after the studio tour, Lucille Ball sent another letter. Inside was an invitation to a private dinner at Desilu Studios for retired crew members who had worked on the early sound stages. 23 people were invited. 19 came. George Hendricks was one of them. So was a man named Arthur Bloom, who had been a grip at Paramount. So was a woman named Helen Chen, who had been a script supervisor at RKO. They were all people who had built the infrastructure that made Hollywood possible and who had been replaced as the industry grew. They had dinner in a soundstage that had been cleared and set with tables. Lucille Ball attended. So did Desi Arnaz. They did not make speeches. They sat at the tables and ate and talked about the early days. Arthur Bloom said something during dinner that George repeated to his wife that night. 50 years in this business, Arthur said. Nobody remembers the people who built the rooms, but she remembered. George Hendricks still has the letters. They are in a drawer in the desk in the small house in Palm Springs where he and Dorothy have lived for 56 years. He has taken them out occasionally over the years when something calls for it. The story, in his telling, does not need most of the details. It begins with a broken radiator and ends with a dinner in a soundstage, and everything in between is just a woman who stopped when she didn't have to and chose to do something with what she found there. If this story reminded you that the smallest acknowledgement, a name remembered, a ticket sent, a dinner shared, can be the thing a person carries for the rest of their life, subscribe, leave a comment, and hit that notification bell. More stories about who Lucille Ball really was, away from the cameras and the credits, are coming every single week.